Hi, everyone. Phil Travis here. Actually, I'm re-recording the opening slide here just because my last slide, which is a little bit long in duration, it kind of got cut off short. Now I want to just make a last point that I think will tie into what we're talking about. So this is History 448, Modern Russia, of course. Today's this PowerPoint is on the origins of the Cold War. So it's kind of a general overview of what the Cold War was and some of the factors in causing the Cold War. And what I wanted to just mention before you guys kind of listen to the next two slides, historians debate whether or not the Cold War was inevitable or not. Was it destined to happen, or was it the result of chance because of the actions of individuals or differences in ideology and so forth? And historians don't fully agree on that. But one thing that historians do agree on, for the most part, is that neither side was uniquely responsible. There were things that the Soviet Union did and ideas and actions carried out by Stalin that helped bring about the Cold War. But there were also many decisions and actions and ideas carried out by individuals like Harry Truman in the United States that also factored fundamentally to bringing about the Cold War. In retrospect, when we look at the late 1940s and the development of the Cold War, it's certainly an incredibly challenging situation, and it's incredibly difficult for us from a United States standpoint to imagine the difficulty of the decisions that Harry Truman made. But regardless of that fact, one thing is absolutely the case, and that is that both the Soviet Union and the United States contributed in many ways to the development of the Cold War. Whether it was the United States' desire to hold on to the atomic monopoly, or the Soviet Union's desire to occupy Eastern Germany and use it to, haul reparations back to Moscow. Whether it was the decision of the United States to create NATO and use the Marshall Plan as a way of attempting to sever open the Soviet Union, or whether it was the Soviet Union's rather misleading actions in areas of Iran, from Iran to Eastern Europe, in places like Poland. Regardless of which one of those we might say factors more, the reality is there's lots of factors on both sides. Neither one side was fully responsible for bringing about the Cold War. And so that was kind of the ending point. So now you can kind of listen and see where we're going for the rest of these slides. So I hope you guys enjoy it, and I hope this stuff is helpful. Thanks, guys. So I just wanted to take a minute. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Cold War. What is the Cold War? Take a second to think about this. What is the Cold War? So, I'm sure most of you guys came up with something like this. The Cold War is a standoff between two superpowers, the United States and the USSR. Two empires, the great Western U.S. kind of global capitalist empire and the Soviet socialist empire, more of a landed empire based on controlling territories. It's a standoff between these two. It's not a shooting war directly between the two, but it's a standoff that lasts for basically a half century. A standoff that was embodied by massive militarization, construction of nuclear armaments that are incomprehensible in terms of their scale. Weapons that were ultimately 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It was a polarization of the world. During the Cold War, the world became divided really among three camps ultimately. One camp, the Soviet Union and its allies, and the centerpiece of the Soviet Union being what we would call the Warsaw Pact, which were the Eastern and Central European states occupied by the Soviet Union after World War II, and of course Russia and the SSRs in places like Ukraine, and of course Russia as a whole. The other side, NATO, the United States and its allies, Western Europe, Canada, the United States, NATO, the Western powers, Japan included in that. And then, of course, the third party in the kind of Cold War era is a group of countries located particularly in the developing world, countries that had recently obtained their independence, that become known as the non-aligned movement. And these include capitalist countries and socialist countries who say, we're not aligning with either the Soviet Union or the United States. We're not going to align with one of the blocs. And these are countries like India, Egypt, Yugoslavia is a great example. Yugoslavia was a socialist, communist country, really a communist country that kept itself outside of the influence of the Soviet bloc. So there are these kind of three parties in this world. But to simplify, the Cold War is referring to a period in which the world is polarized between two groups. It's a bipolar world order, by the groups who are allies and affiliates of the United States and NATO, and those who are allies and affiliates of the communist Soviet bloc. And so the Cold War was a period of time in which revolutions raged in the developing world, and the allies and affiliates of the West versus those of the East battled and fought and struggled to win parts of the developing world to their sphere of influence. The Vietnam War, the Korean War, numerous brushfire wars, if you will, in places like Central America, South America, Africa. These conflicts are all struggles. The Middle East were all struggles in one way or another between the West and the East over controlling spheres of influence in the world. So the United States and the Soviet Union ultimately established loose empires that you might refer to as spheres of influence, that each side has kind of a sort of hegemony in terms of its economics and its influence within its pole, if you will, within its sphere of influence, and is constantly vying with the other great hegemonic power for expanding its influence in the world. And of course, this came at the massive environmental destruction, the prolonging of revolutionary wars in places like Southeast Asia, anti-colonial wars, wars of decolonization, massive nuclear build-up, nuclear arms races. Nuclear proliferation as a problem today is a consequence of the Cold War. On many levels, the war on terrorism in certain places today is a consequence of the Cold War. Many of the figures that the United States or the Russians today choose to ally with in one way or another oftentimes are linked back to long-term Cold War alliances. One great example is the Russian alliance with Bashar Assad in Syria. That's a long-term Cold War alliance there. So the Cold War is deeply, deeply significant. Understanding conflicts in the world today, like the conflict in Ukraine and the role of the Crimea, it requires an understanding of history that goes back, in fact, goes back further than the Cold War, goes back well over a century past the Cold War's beginning, but nonetheless, understanding the roots of the Cold War. Very significant to understanding some of the factors in a conflict like the current conflict in Ukraine. So, I wanted to mention many historians debate the causes of the Cold War, what brought it about. One of the greatest historians, Walter Lefebvre, says it was about empire. It was about a U.S. empire that was driven by the promotion and the pursuit of open markets, that went back to traditions like the open door policy with China during the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt and William McKinley, to the policy of Woodrow Wilson, which was basically Wilson's idea for the world, was that peace for the United States would come when the rest of the world was sort of democratic capitalist states like the United States, and when principles of free trade and open markets were upheld by all. The Soviet Empire was a landed empire. It went back to the time of the czars, but it was an empire based on controlling territory and using the control of its territory to insulate, ultimately, the Leninist-Stalinist state from the world wars that leaders like Stalin thought were inevitably going to be fought by what they would have seen as the world imperialist powers. So some historians like Walter Lefebvre, Walter Lefebvre is a renowned historian. He's long since retired, but he wrote some of the most influential books about why the Cold War happened, this long struggle between these militarized powers in the aftermath of World War II. Most historians say the Cold War begins in 1947, around the time of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, and ultimately the formation of NATO and Warsaw Pact. Those refer to the alliances of the Soviet bloc and the Western U.S. bloc. But Lefebvre really draws it back. He says this is about expanding empires. He says this, in fact, Lefebvre goes back to the late industrial age in the 1800s for the United States, and he says the United States is constantly expanding for open markets. The Soviet Union is expanding in a landed sense and trying to insulate itself from that. And with the end of World War II, with the vacuum in Europe, the two entities are sort of brought colliding up against one another. And so in that respect, Walter Lefebvre has a long-term economic interpretation that is highly critical of U.S. empire. If you were to read some of Lefebvre's best works like America, Russia, and the Cold War, it's pretty clear that he's a little bit more critical of the U.S. empire. But he's an American historian, so that, it's not surprising. This is a global conflict, and it was a global conflict that was fought in an indirect nature. And horrible, bloody wars from Afghanistan to Vietnam. Afghanistan, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, which we'll talk a little bit about in a couple of weeks. A bloody war that was involved in revolutions throughout the developing world, and also a conflict that threatened nuclear annihilation. And the degree to which that influenced American culture, particularly culture in general in the world, really cannot be overstated. So if we look at the origins of the Cold War, and you see here pictured Truman, Churchill, and of course Joseph Stalin at Potsdam, if you look at the origins of the Cold War, the causes of the Cold War, one of the first causes is economics. And of course this is linked to ideology, but the fact that the United States, a global capitalist empire in the 20th century, the United States sought open markets, open doors. And by contrast, the Soviet Union, which was designed at least as being a socialist state, or a communist state that would be based on central planning and would be based on largely insulating itself from the potentially fractious involvement of Western capitalists. So these were two approaches to global economics and position in the world that certainly led to differences that, through other factors, led to the Cold War. There are also strategic interests that are connected to this, national security interests. If you were to ask Woodrow Wilson would say something to the effect that U.S. security was based on other countries adhering to the principles of the United States, which were really principles of global democratic capitalism, free trade capitalism. By contrast, the Soviet perspective on its security was that because it was a different type of entity, because it was a communist or socialist state, it had to insulate itself from the West, which it deemed, leaders from Lenin to Stalin believed that world wars amongst the European and the Western powers were inevitable because of, in their interpretation, because of imperialistic capitalism, which created international competition and created revolutions in various places. So he believed that these revolutions were inevitable. And so as a result of this, individuals like Stalin sought buffer zones. They sought landed area between them and Western Europe to act as a security zone, a buffer zone, against a future potential attack from a resurgent German nation. Stalin also sought that buffer zone in Eastern Europe. I'm talking about places like Poland, Romania, for example, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Of course, Stalin also sought these areas at the end of World War II for the purpose of obtaining reparations for the Soviet Union, the rebuilding of the Soviet Union through a use of the industrialized portions of Central Europe. So there was also that component to this. But Stalin very much believed that he had to control a certain area of Eastern Europe. And of course, during the war, Stalin had kind of implied to the West that he would disband the Comintern, and as a result, he would, effectively end the promotion of communism abroad. And by contrast, Western leaders at times, both Churchill and Roosevelt, Western leaders at times implied that we would accept some degree of Soviet buffer zone. So during the war, as the Soviets and the United States and the British were sort of allies of convenience, allies who had a central grievance, both sides were kind of struggling with these differences. The United States is intent on having an open market world, if you will. The Soviets' intent to insulate itself from the open market world and to largely use conquered areas in Central and Eastern Europe as a way to rebuild the Soviet state, as well as to protect it from what were perceived as almost inevitable aggressive activities by Western powers. But the Western allies and the Eastern allies, the Soviets and the British and the United States, went to great lengths while FDR was alive to kind of balance these things. FDR, unlike Truman, and this gets us to one of the other causes of the Cold War's leadership, FDR was very, very famous ultimately for what would be known as his quid pro quo approach. FDR believed you had to work with Stalin, that there had to be some type of workable relationship with Stalin. And even the architect of containment policy, before it's fundamentally changed, George Kennan, the American-Soviet specialist, had said in his long telegram in 1946, after the war was over and Truman was president, George Kennan had said, the Soviets are certainly dangerous, and there's certainly a menace in certain border areas, something that we should be concerned about. But George Kennan very much thought that you had to take a form of limited action that would contain the Soviets long enough for the Soviets to basically participate with the rest of the world. George Kennan, the architect of containment policy, and FDR, it doesn't appear, ever had the idea that there should be this long-term polarization of the world into Eastern and Western blocs, which is, of course, what happened. And the Cold War lasts for, almost the entire second half of the 20th century, with incredibly lasting consequences for the world. So leadership was a big factor in why the Cold War happened, because Truman, who was out of the loop, when Truman became president, effectively, Truman hadn't been told anything. I mean, FDR, who was a great president, but, like all great presidents, you can still criticize aspects. FDR basically kept Truman completely out of the loop. FDR played Secretary of State as well as president, and so many of his advisors didn't really know what FDR's true approach was, and FDR changed his position on things from time to time. And Harry Truman was very much left out of the loop. Harry Truman didn't know about the atomic bomb. He didn't know the position of Roosevelt on a number of things, from Southeast Asia to Stalin in Eastern Europe. And when Truman becomes president, Truman's from Independence, Missouri, and unlike FDR, FDR's more of an intellectual president. Truman was a president who was more driven to make a stand, as a president who was more driven to not be the guy who let another, aggressive power overrun Europe. So Truman was very much motivated by what might be called the lessons of Munich. The Munich crisis, of course, in 1938, when the Allies appeased Hitler and Hitler went to conquer, effectively all of Europe for a period of time. Truman was deeply driven to not allow that to happen again. And because of this reason, Truman was icy cold in his association with the foreign minister, Molotov, and also, of course, with Stalin. He talked down to Molotov in a way that offended Molotov, and in a way that very much surprised them after their dealings with Roosevelt. And on key areas of interest for the Soviet Union that the United States had suggested it would work with, under Truman, the United States very much went a hard line. On issues of territories like Poland that might be occupied, Truman said absolutely not, there's no discussion of that. And of course, it's difficult to know how FDR would have come off on that. But Truman's far more standoffish on access to the Black Sea, around the Bosphorus Straits from the Black Sea down past Greece. The British and the United States had suggested that they would allow the Soviets to exert their influence there. And of course, that it's been something the Soviets had wanted to do for a long period of time. And of course, ultimately, the United States balks at that, and so does the British balk at that. And the United States instead enacts the Truman Doctrine to effectively prop up the government of Turkey and Greece as pro-American governments, as ultimately NATO-associated governments that could move to prevent any expansion of Soviet influence into the Bosphorus Strait area. Iranian oil, the Soviet Union, the British, and the Iranians had arranged for the end of the World War. Stalin had taken it to mean that the Soviet Union would have a right to some kind of access to Iranian oil, along with the Western powers. And of course, the British and the United States ultimately balk at that too, and they say after the war there's crises in northern Iran where the Soviet Union were inspiring a revolt and threatening to take influence in Iran, and the United States and the Soviet Union almost went toe-to-toe at that moment in 1946. But from Stalin's perspective, these were areas where the Soviet Union in the West had kind of agreed that the Soviet Union could exert greater influence and take certain rights and liberties. Of course, it was hardly clear that there was a position on these areas, at least from FDR. So leadership really mattered. In one respect, the Soviet leadership. Stalin was described by George Kennan, a leader who was advantageous and opportunistic. He was not irrational. Stalin was not the same threat as Hitler, and that was one of the problems with Truman thinking or imagining the Soviet threat as the same as the threat of Nazi Germany. In reality, our best specialists on the Soviet Union at that time, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, agreed that the Soviet Union was a threat that was, one, wounded. It was incredibly decimated by World War II. 25 million people, approximately, died in one way or another in the Soviet Union during World War II. So it was a wounded empire. It was weak. It wasn't strong in any way, shape, or form compared to the United States in the aftermath of World War II. It was hardly prepared for any type of aggressive action. And American specialists said that the Soviet Union would only act opportunistically. And George Kennan, the father of containment policy, had said that the United States should oppose the Soviet Union in key strong point areas, and it should do so, almost scientifically, that she would oppose the Soviet Union's desire to expand in certain key areas, access to important resources and these types of things in Western Europe, but you would do this in a limited fashion, and that the Soviet Union would ultimately agree to accept a compromise and a kind of a living with the West, if you will. And of course, that doesn't happen. The world becomes polarized between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and the world becomes militarized with huge arms races and huge military buildups. So leadership really mattered. It's difficult for us to ever know. Could FDR, the savvy politician, the savvy leader, have at least created a greater semblance of compromise with the Soviet Union? Very difficult to say. And so the leadership of Truman, the leadership of Stalin was a factor in bringing about the Cold War. Ideology differences between the West, free markets, capitalist world capitalism versus kind of planned socialist state. That ideology was fundamentally different. And John Lewis Gaddis, a historian, has said that ideology made the Cold War basically an inevitability once the vacuum in Europe was opened up and the Soviets and the United States kind of collided there. Strategic interests, Stalin's desire to control Central and Eastern Europe. That was a critical factor in how the Cold War began, and the response of individuals like Truman to that was also a key factor in why it began. And again, global economics, free markets. So the Cold War came about because of a number of factors, and neither factor was to blame for one side or the other. Instead, there were decisions made by specific leaders on both sides that created the situation that we ultimately know as the Cold War.